Hi, I'm Victoria Dougherty, and we're back for another edition of Love at First Right. I'm a blogger, and I'm historically a Cold War thriller writer who is endeavoring to write a great epic romance. And this week, we are going to be talking about the villain and villainy. Um, this is one of my favorite topics because I find villains really exciting. They are the sort of yang to the protagonist yin, and without them, you really have kind of a boring story. And what stories are without villains? They just don't exist. Um, so let's get started. First, I think I want to say that, like a protagonist, like our hero, rather, a villain has to have three elements. He has to have purpose, or she has purpose, charisma, and a journey. Now, purpose, I mean, we've talked about male characters and female characters, and we've talked about the male character having a moral purpose. And with the villain, obviously, the purpose is usually not moral, or it's a twisted morality. For instance, he might love the same woman that our male protagonist is in love with. However, his love is corrosive and corrupt and obsessive, perhaps, and he wishes to destroy her if he can't have her. But a villain's purpose could also just be as basic as raw survival. It could be power. It could really be any number of things. It could be jealousy. It could be, oh, loneliness. I remember, I think about the movie and the book. I've seen and read The Exorcist, and I think one of the most powerful parts of that story about that villain, which is of course a devil, right? Um, is actually very subtle, and it gets slipped in there. At one point, the priest who is going to be doing the exorcism has tape recorded the devil speaking backwards, and when he plays it forward, you hear, "I am no one, I am no one," and it's this painfully um, lonely uh, sort of cry that reveals this devil's dilemma, his purpose, this loneliness. And this is why he's preying on this 13-year-old girl, and why he's making mischief on God's earth. um, so purpose is absolutely vital to having a really interesting villain that that can go on a journey then, because without a purpose you don't go on a journey. And this sort of we'll talk about journey a little bit more in a few minutes, but I do want to talk about the charisma of a villain, because I think a villain has to be charismatic. Without that, without a villain that is as charismatic as the lead characters, I think a story just falls flat. And he's got to be really someone to contend with, and someone that you um, perhaps both fear and yet are also attracted to. Um, One of the most interesting villains, I think, in literature as well as in the movies is the shark in Jaws, of all things, which kind of seems funny since, the shark isn't a person. But as I look at how Peter Benchley, the author of Jaws, and Steven Spielberg, who is a sort of, co-author in a sense, because he really did bring that story to life in a way that I at least feel it did not quite come to life in the same way on the page. Is that the shark does have these incredible contradictions. The shark is charismatic. And in the book, as well as the movie, the shark is smarter than the average shark. This is a smart shark that is chasing these humans and getting the best of them. He ends up actually going after, Brody, the police chief, and Quinn, the fisherman, and Matt Hooper, the shark expert, as they're out on this fishing boat. The shark is actually chasing them when, all along we humans have thought that sharks are just mindless eating machines, which is, I think, what Matt Hooper, the shark expert, actually tells us, and he's wrong. Um, and what is so interesting about the way they give the shark style, at least in the movie, the shark really doesn't have that much style. He has a tremendous amount of suspense in the book. But in the movie, the shark is given style with the movie soundtrack. Every time the shark comes on the scene or is about to come on the scene, we hear Donna, Donna. And that music is not only incredibly suspenseful and frightening, but sexy. The beat of it is really, really sensual and sexual in nature, and sort of dresses that shark up in a tuxedo so that he becomes more than just a fish. He becomes more like a Bond villain. And I found that really fascinating that the shark was able to be made such a character in the story rather than simply a monster. um, I, I think that in terms of a journey, I want to talk about Jack Torrance in The Shining, and I'm talking about the book Stephen Spielberg, Stephen King's The Shining, not so much Stanley Kubrick's, because I think that in The Shining, as Stephen King wrote it, Jack Torrance actually has um, a, a much more nuanced journey, and in my opinion, a more compelling journey. Even though I loved Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, but in The Shining, uh, the journey just seems pretty straightforward with Jack Torrance. He just gets worse. He just kind of keeps going downhill, and he's not really fighting it. He's embracing it, and in the end, he just becomes a member of that hotel, a strange sort of ghostly member of that terrible place. Um, that brings people in and makes them murder their families. Brings weak men in actually and makes them murder their families. That's a really important distinction. But in The Shining, Jack Torrance has a little bit more nuance going on, and it really comes to light when he is chasing his son through that frozen maze at the end. Because Stephen King does something that Stanley Kubrick does not do in The Shining. Stephen King, as Jack Torrance is chasing his son, the son, I think he falls down or something, and just as Jack Torrance is about to strike him down with an axe and kill him, for a moment he comes to himself and he says, "Run, Danny, run!" And then he goes back to being a homicidal maniac again. But it gives the boy just enough time to run away. And you see that glimpse of humanity in this father who, before freezing to death, does manage to save his son. And in a sense, sacrifices himself for his child, which is something that Jack Torrance in The Shining doesn't do. He really just kind of turns into a monster and stays in that place. But I did find, I mean, I love both, but I did find the Stephen King version more compelling for that reason, and that is something that I think we need to struggle with, and that we really need to think very, very hard about as we're creating our villains, as we're looking for moments of humanity, moments of goodness in them, because I think that if they don't have that, um, it becomes a real danger in the story. I mean, yes, sometimes a mindless killing machine can be really interesting, like in the Terminator or something. Um, but I think it's rare, and I think that's definitely that when we're writing a novel, that we can't get away with that. The way a movie might be able to cheat by because they have the visual and because they have music and they have all sorts of things that they can add to that villain that could make up for the nuances that I think must be there in a well-written story. Um, Hannibal Lecter is a great character as well, because he has tremendous style. You know, if you have a moment, Charles Bukowski, the poet, go to YouTube and look up Charles Bukowski on style, and it's a reading that he gives where he's talking about style. It's very short; it's only a couple of minutes long, but it is so worth watching because he goes into the nitty gritty of style in a way that I think is very counterintuitive. For instance, he talks about Hemingway blowing his brains out and smearing them all over the wall as dying with style. And that is the spirit in which I like to approach a villain's style. You know, Hannibal Lecter, I think I just mentioned him. I'm not sure, but I've wanted to mention him. So Hannibal Lecter has tremendous style and resents people. It resents people. He is homicidal against people who he feels have no style, who offend his aesthetic sensibilities. And that makes him compelling because, you know, all of us have been offended by someone who we feel is grotesque or uncouth or vulgar. And we can't even really see that person's humanity because of that. I mean, you know, we can think of, oh, I don't know, you know, certain certain political figures. We don't even have to go there. That's not right. But I think that, you know, people can really dehumanize someone, and so we see a little bit of ourselves as well in Hannibal Lecter, and we can see the way that we sometimes take from people's humanity, and he, of course, takes it to an extreme and kills and eats his prey. So. That sort of, you know, that sort of complexity is vital and brings the villain to life and makes us want to follow his journey. And that journey can take him or her to all sorts of places. I mean, in some stories, it can lead to redemption. I think that Jack Torrance in The Shining was somewhat redeemed because he may have certainly become one of these evil ghosts uh, in this haunted hotel, but he went down that road sacrificing himself just in that one moment when he saves his son. And you know, you can think about a character like Victor Karamovsky in or Kamarowski, excuse me, in Dr. Zhivago, you know, who really is an amoral, you know, um, corrupt sort of son of a bitch, but he loves Laura. He does love Laura, and even though he treats her terribly and he humiliates her and he uses her sexually, he still loves her, and in the end, he saves her life. That doesn't really fully redeem him because he also is responsible for her losing her daughter. He lets go of that daughter's hand at the end in Mongolia, you know, and it's not shown in the movie, and it's really not shown in the book either. It's merely talked about, but we see the complexity of that character. That, you know, even as he's saving the woman he loves, he's breaking her heart by letting go of her daughter. And that is the beauty and the complexity of a villain. And I think that as we are writing our villains and as we are writing of their villainy, we also need to be very mindful of um, of not showing too much. You know, in the book Dracula, which is, I think, one of the most masterful books ever written. I mean, not just most masterful horror story ever written, but I really think it is just an incredible book. But we hardly ever encounter Dracula. We hardly see him. We hardly meet him. Just a tiny sort of in little vignettes throughout the story we meet him, but yet he has such a presence. And I think the same is true of the shark in Jaws. And the less we see of this villain, um, but the more dangerous we make him, the threat of his danger or her danger um, becomes so overwhelming then in the story, and I mean overwhelming in a good way, so that once they actually do get to that point where they actually practice their villainy openly and they do something absolutely horrible, it is so shocking, and it is just so fulfilling to a reader that we are just, grabbed by the lapels and ripped into that terrible part of the story and made forced to watch it. So that is about all about villainy today. But again, this is one of those topics that we are most certainly going to revisit because it is just too juicy not to. And there's so much to say. But I don't want to keep you here for so long. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time.